Hello, welcome to another Friday live stream. I am here to answer your questions. My name is Laura Forsick. I am the executive director of space consulting firm Astrolytical. I have 20 years in the space industry. Really excited to talk about today's topic. And I wanted to apologize for last week. I don't know what happened, but apparently YouTube sometimes eats live streams. So I recorded a whole 30 minutes and there's a whole minute of it on the YouTube archive. So sorry about that. But if you are interested in getting these insights, not only in video format, but also in written format in your inbox, you can sign up for Astrolytical's weekly newsletter, which is new. And so really excited to share that with you. It is a Substack, so you can go on Substack or you can go to astrolytical.com/subscribe. The link is in the show notes. Really excited to bring you the abridged version of this in your inbox every Monday. So moving on from that, I did want to thank our veterans. Today is it's not Veterans Day, but it's the day that we remember Veterans Day because it's a weekday and Veterans Day falls on a weekend today. Sorry, I'm blanking on what that's called. But happy Veterans Day and thank you for your service and thank you to your families as well. So I want to talk today about Starship, as I did, I think, last week. But I want to talk about it in the context of private missions to the moon. And so full disclosure, this is something that I have always wanted to do. I have been, ever since a little girl, really been fascinated by the moon, excited about going to the moon, really loving the opportunity to someday go to the moon. And so when Artemis was announced and Constellation before it, I was just over the moon about the idea of sending humans back to the moon. But of course, I am not a NASA astronaut, nor am I a government astronaut. So it'll be quite some time before I and anybody else can set foot on the moon unless you are a government astronaut. However, there are some really cool private missions circumlunar, so going around the moon, that have already been announced using SpaceX's Starship. But I want to give some context first. I want to talk about the current status of Starship in case you just are brand new to space and you don't know much about Starship. I'm not going to give you a whole overview, just a brief introduction here. It is going to be the largest rocket that has ever been created and launched to go to orbit. So it'll bring more payloads, more people to space than ever before that has ever existed. So you hear a lot about, Saturn V back in the day, or about SLS, the Space Launch System today. Starship is going to top them all. And that makes it really exciting because we don't really know what the future potential of that will be. So Starship was initially announced back in 2012 under the name Mars Colonial Transporter or Mars Cargo Transporter, MCT. And it's gone through several other iterations as well. Interplanetary Transport System, ITS, or who remembers BFR, and is that Big Falcon Rocket or Big Fucking Rocket? So that is the background of what was the big rocket that is now Starship. And of course, Starship itself has gone through multiple iterations, and it had its first high altitude test flight back in December of 2020. And then again in February 2021. And those got up to about 10, 12 kilometers. So space, according to the international definition, is 100 kilometers. According to the US definition, it's about 80 kilometers or 50 miles. And so it didn't get to space, but it got fairly high. That's nothing to dismiss. But you might remember back April 20th of this year, the first orbital launch attempt of Starship that was spectacular in its attempt. Let's put it that way. And they haven't made another attempt since, but we are awaiting, as of this recording, I haven't looked at the past 20 minutes, but as of this recording, there has not been an FAA license issued for the next orbital launch attempt, but SpaceX is really hoping that it'll be mid-November, which is like now, next week, hopefully. We'll just have to see when that FAA license is issued. So Starship itself is a multi-purpose vehicle. It's going to go to Mars. That's the whole reason SpaceX exists in the first place, is to send humans to Mars. However, in the meantime, it can send cargo and people to orbit. It can do what's called point-to-point suborbital transportation. And the DoD, the Department of Defense, is especially interested in this, where it could take cargo or people, hypothetically, from one part of the world to another very, very fast by going up in space for about 5 minutes and then coming back down somewhere else on the planet. It could also go to the moon. And that is what we're going to be focusing on today, is circumlunar and lunar missions to the moon. Now, when I say circumlunar, I mean going around the moon. So think of those earlier Apollo missions that did not land. So the first landing was Apollo 11, but the earlier ones, they went around the moon. And even Apollo 13 wasn't intentionally a circumlunar mission, but it ended up being a circumlunar mission. And so that is something that is a good practice for before you go to the moon. There have been a few Starship circumlunar missions, private missions, so space tourism missions, if you prefer, that have been announced. Spectacularly, back in 2018, there was a mission called the DearMoon project that was announced and fully funded by a Japanese billionaire, and I apologize if I'm messing up the name, I always mess it up, Yusaku Maezawa. I know Japanese is so easy to pronounce, and yet I forget each time how it's pronounced. But you might remember him because he actually flew on the International Space Station with a company called Space Adventures on the Russian side. So Roscosmos was a partner. The Russian Space Agency was a partner with that mission. This was before the war with Ukraine. So since then, there have been no more space adventures missions with Roscosmos, but this was the last one. And Yosaku Maezawa, he flew with an assistant of his for a multi-day mission on the International Space Station. And back in 2018, he announced that he has bought an entire Starship mission and has he ran a bit of a competition to pick 8 additional crew members to fly for free. And that was announced with great fanfare. They are 8 creatives or influencers, if you will. You can see the list on their website. And they haven't really talked about it, but they have announced in the past that along with these 9 crew members, and along with these 9 passengers, there's also going to be a few SpaceX and crew members. They haven't really given the details, probably because they haven't hashed out those details as to what that might look like and who that might be. The mission date back in 2018 was announced to be 2023. And the reason I'm talking about this is because yesterday there was an announcement by DearMoon project that it's not happening in 2023, which I think that's to surprise of no one that this mission is not happening in the next 2 months. When is it going to happen is an excellent question. And that's what I'm going to probe a little bit more as we speak to give you better context about what's coming up and so where this mission could fit amongst many different Starship crewed missions. Okay, so the announcement in particular back in 2018 was also not promising that it would launch in 2023. I want to do a quote from Elon Musk here. We're definitely not sure about is the quote, about the 2023 date. And then he again says, quote, "We need to set a things go right date. We're not even sure we can bring it to flight, but we're going to do everything humanly possible," end quote. And that's my abbreviation of the quote. You know, he said some other things in there, but I was transcribing the announcement at the moment back in 2018. And so that is what I wrote down that he said. So even Elon Musk, as aspirational as he is, was hedging. He was saying that, it's probably not going to be 2023. We're going to try if everything goes right. It might be 2023, but it's probably not. And so right now we're at the point where the announcement yesterday said, we don't really know when it's coming. We'll let you know when we know more. That was essentially the announcement yesterday. But this mission, this DearMoon project, it might have been the first mission announced to go to the moon with Starship, but it was not the only mission. There are 2 other Starship missions that have already been announced that have people on board that are fully private missions. They are not related to any government mission. And the one I want to talk about next is the Polaris project, specifically the third of these 3 Polaris project missions. I'm sorry, Polaris program. I always mix that up. In fact, in my notes, it's wrong. So if you bear with me, I'm going to fix that, because I'm just going to say it wrong every time. Polaris program. So this was announced back in 2022. Jarek Isaacman is funding all 3 of these missions. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because he flew with SpaceX and Dragon to a 3-day orbital mission on Inspiration 4. He funded a mission where he flew himself and 3 other people around the Earth, low Earth orbit on a free-flying Crew Dragon for 3 days. And that must have gotten him so inspired that he decided he needed to do more. And so that is the Polaris program, which the first mission here, we're looking at, I have it written down, early 2024 is the current estimation of when the first Polaris program mission will take place. That's Polaris Dawn. There's 2 other missions after Polaris Dawn. The third one is advertised to be the first crewed Starship mission. So the first one ever. So even though this is not a lunar mission here, It is a private Starship mission, and in fact, it's said to be the first private Starship mission that it will be crewed. Starship will, of course, have uncrewed missions first to prove that Starship works, but this was the first one that they're saying is going to put humans on board, which is tremendously exciting. But also keep in mind that this is a fully private mission, and these are not government trained astronauts. Jarek Eisenman flew for the first time on Inspiration 4 in 2021, and they are in a sense self-trained, and they went through SpaceX's training, but they also went through other training missions. They went through like the NASTAR Center training. They went through Zero G Corporation training. They went through all kinds of training. Jarek Eisenman is a pilot, and so he had access to a lot of different high performance jets, and so they did training there. But it's not government training. It's not training by NASA or training by a government agency elsewhere. So that makes this really fascinating, because essentially what the Polaris program is saying is that we're going to go first. We're going to prove out this brand new, never before flown on vehicle that, yes, will have uncrewed missions first, but they're going to be the first to put themselves on the line. And so just trying to estimate when this is actually going to happen, this third Polaris program mission. The first Polaris Dawn mission here, this one has been delayed. And so now it's like early 2024. They don't have an exact date. And I'm going to go ahead and estimate annual. So let's say that Polaris Dawn happens and it's perfect, just like Inspiration 4 was essentially perfect. And I'm going to say that it's like every year. So 2024 is the first one, 2025 is the second one, 2026 is the third one. And my basis for estimating annually is because there was actually a 2-year gap here between Inspiration 4 and Polaris Dawn. I think Jarek Eisenman already had this idea in his head that he was going to do more missions. I don't think he expected Inspiration 4 to be his only mission. So there's this 2-year gap. And even though Inspiration 4 is a different mission from the Polaris program missions, I would say that they're really related. They're like sequels. The second reason why I think annual is a good estimation is because we can look at what Axiom Space is doing. So Axiom Space is flying private astronaut missions to the International Space Station in partnership with SpaceX on a Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon. And initially, they planned 2 of those a year, so approximately every 6 months. But in reality, they're ending up being annual. So the first one, Axiom 1, was in April of 2022. Second one was in May 2023. This third one here is no earlier than January 2024. We all know it's probably going to be delayed. So let's just say like February or like early 2024. So generally speaking, they're annual, even though they were planned to be every 6 months. So we can assume that, if everything goes right, an annual cadence of these Polaris program missions is about a good estimate. So why am I harping on this? Is because we're trying to figure out when this first crewed Starship mission is going to occur. This is a wild guess, but just based on the evidence, the thinking, the analysis that I just said, I think that a maybe early 2026 date might actually be a good date to predict that a first Starship crewed mission might be taking place with that third Polaris program mission. Again, I have no other basis to go with that 2026 date other than what I just said. But I think that's a good, a good starting point. I also want to talk about one more Starship crewed mission that will go around the moon. So that is Dennis Tito and his wife, Akito. And Dennis Tito's name might be familiar to you because he was the first space tourist or private space passenger or private spaceflight participant, however you want to say it. He flew on the International Space Station in 2001 with that company I mentioned earlier, Space Adventures with Through Roscosmos. And he got the space bug. But he said he did not want to do another mission to the ISS. He did not want to do another low Earth orbit mission. He wanted to do something different. So he purchased 2 seats on a flight, a future flight that is separate from Polaris, that is separate from DearMoon. So a third Starship mission here that could actually hold an additional 10 passengers. And we haven't had any announcements since this. This was announced in 2002. So he purchased the seats in 2001. They announced it in 2002, and we haven't had any updates since then as to when this might take place or who else might join him and his wife. But he's getting up there in age. He's in his 80s, I think 82 when the announcement was made, something like that. And so just have to see how long he can wait before he can't fly anymore, or hopefully he'll hang on, because we know from, William Shatner's flight on Blue Origin that people who are up there in age can actually safely fly. But of course, a quick Blue Origin suborbital New Shepard flight is much less demanding than a a circumlunar mission would be, I assume. Yeah, it's a good assumption. So we don't know really when this mission is taking place. It's probably a lower priority. We don't even know if they've sold those other 10 seats. My guess is they haven't. So we're just going to have to see when that happens. And why do we care about this in the context of the Artemis program? Because I mentioned, at least in the show notes here, that this really has a big impact. These private missions on Starship have a big impact on NASA's Artemis return to the moon and go on to Mars kind of missions. And the reason is because NASA awarded a human lander, HLS, Human Landing System contract to SpaceX for its first missions. So what's really exciting about this is that traditionally, back in the Apollo days, NASA just contracted everything out, right? NASA contracted Grumman, before it was Northrop Grumman, it was called Grumman, to build the LEM, the lunar module. But now NASA has this kind of like, yes, it's still contracting out things. So it's contracted out to Boeing and Lockheed Martin to build SLS and Orion. But it also has this other mentality of buying seats or buying spacesuits from commercial partners. And so that's exactly what HLS is. It is buying a seat or multiple seats on a vehicle that will take humans down to the surface of the moon and bring them back. Artemis 3 is the first one, and that's not envisioned to actually take them all the way from the moon to the moon. I'm sorry, not envisioned to take them all the way from Earth to the moon and then moon to Earth. It's going to involve multiple steps here with SLS Orion, Gateway, which is the small lunar space station, and the HLS, the Starship HLS. And so we're just looking at Starship HLS being the delivery mechanism for people to land on the moon, to get onto the moon and then come back out into space and then reconvene with Gateway. I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole other live stream. Let me know if you want me to talk about that convoluted architecture, which has much more to do with geopolitics than it does with actual logic or cost savings. But in any case, that's why this is so important, is because NASA is relying on Starship, a variant of Starship, HLS, to be able to get its astronauts to the surface of the moon. And we are in a geopolitical environment where NASA sees itself, or at least the US government sees itself, as competing with China to send humans to the moon. It's not a race. I know that space race is a big, nice, fun rhyming buzz phrase, but I personally don't think it's a race. You can disagree with me, but I think it's a competition. We've already done it during Apollo. We've already done it several times during Apollo. What we're seeing now is, can we do it again? Can we do it again sustainably? Can we do it again in a way that proves that we are capable technologically of making this happen and then just continuing on rather than giving up for 50 years, which is what we did after Apollo. There were other nuances there, but I won't get into that. So what we see here is NASA wanting to get this done, but also get it done right so that there isn't a big public failure. Because what happens if there is a big public failure and we end up killing astronauts, and besides the loss of life, which is horrible, then you have the headlines that say, oh, China's winning the new space race or something absurd like that. And so there is a lot of pressure on SpaceX to make this happen and to make this happen quickly. It's already been delayed for so long. So to give you another recap here, before it was called Artemis, it was called Exploration Mission. Mission 3, which is the same as Artemis 3, was envisioned for 2028. 2019, Vice President Mike Pence just kind of surprised everybody and announced that, oh, it's not happening in 2028, it's happening in 2024. We're going to land humans on the moon by 2024. Definitely not happening. We knew at the time. At least most people knew at the time. At least most people paying attention knew at the time that it was not happening in 2024. So the timeline right now is that Artemis 3 is scheduled for December 2025, which means there is no universe in the world that's actually happening December 2025. That is not realistic. What we're going to see is a slip into 2026, and probably, in my estimation, just based on my knowledge of the way that these things, evolve, is that 2027 is a probably more realistic date. Some people are even more pessimistic than me. I think it'll happen much closer to 2030. I'm going to go with 2027, see where that goes. But the idea here is that there are a lot of people blaming SpaceX Starship for the delays, and it is one of the delays for sure. To give you some more history, when NASA announced that SpaceX had won that award and was the sole source award, they had initially wanted to pick 2, but they decided to only pick 1, and that being SpaceX. And the other 2 participants in that competition. The other two proposals were by Blue Origin and Dynetics. And they were like, what? You were going to pick two. Now you've just picked SpaceX. And so they actually protested with the Government Accountability Office, the NASA GAO. And NASA GAO said, no, actually, SpaceX is fine. NASA did it right. SpaceX is the sole winner, and your protest is noted but dismissed. And so then Blue Origin sued NASA, and the court said, you don't have a lawsuit here, and they sided with NASA. And so all of that took several months, I think from like April or May to November of 2021, something like that. And there was a stop work order on Starship HLS during that time. So there was delays there in even starting Starship HLS. Of course, Starship for other uses was still being back on all the prototypes, but HLS purposed Starship was not allowed to work until all of those protests and lawsuits were settled. And, fast forward a few years, a couple of years, Blue Origin did actually win another HLS contract. So right now it's set for Artemis 3 and 4 are going to be NASA HLS. Artemis 5, I think they've changed it. It was Artemis 5 was initially just going to be a gateway mission. I think they've now changed it to be a landing mission with Blue Origin, with Blue Moon. So there's another complication here in that NASA is now threatening SpaceX, saying, as of a few months ago at least, Jim Free made a comment about how if Starship HLS is delayed, then maybe we won't have Artemis 3 be a landing mission. Maybe we'll delay the landing missions and have Artemis 3 be just a gateway mission. And oh my gosh. So a lot of people blaming SpaceX Starship delays on the Artemis delays. But there's also things like spacesuits. There's also things like there's a whole other live stream to talk about the delays of SLS and Orion, which have been significant despite more than full funding. And in fact, the NASA Office of Inspector General, OIG, said in November 2021, they quoted Congress significantly underfunded HLS in FY 2021, so contributing to those delays. So even the OIG realizes it's not necessarily even NASA's fault. It's not SpaceX's fault. It's really Congress that didn't give this enough money. Congress has been funding SLS and Orion and all these other things, the launch tower and, all these other parts of SLS and Orion, and have been ignoring the rest of Artemis. So delays. I don't want to make this too long, but I just want to get to the bottom line here is that SpaceX is under tremendous pressure to have Starship operational, have Starship have crew on board, and have Starship HLS work. Those private missions such as are willing to put their lives on the line in a way that NASA simply cannot do because NASA is so high profile. And there, aside from the whole loss of life of the astronauts, which is horrible, there would be congressional hearings, there would be, just pauses, there might even be cancellations, although I hope not. And so NASA really is relying on SpaceX to do it right the first time with Artemis. And so SpaceX really needs to be able to practice with uncrewed missions first, and then maybe with these crewed commercial missions, these space tourism missions. We also have the potential, if everything goes right with Artemis landing missions, to have Starship bring private, which is something I started out the conversation with, that I would love to do that, right? So how many of you out there would love to be on the moon, on the surface of the moon someday, but aren't planning on being government astronauts, can't be chosen to be government astronauts, right? So maybe in the future, and I'm talking like at least a decade out, probably more closer to like 2035, 2040, maybe even beyond 2040, there might actually be a first space tourism mission to the surface of the moon. And this is not outside the realm of possibility because Jarek Isaacman, the one who funded Inspiration 4, the one who's funding these Polaris program missions, has already indicated that he wants to go elsewhere than orbit. So for example, he said to me in my book, when I interviewed him for my book, Becoming Off-Worldly, he said, quote, "I certainly hope that at some point I'm walking on another planet or exploring something other than human beings haven't been able to explore, to see in person before," end quote. And so another planet, another planetary body being the moon or Mars. And that's my final point here, is that the ultimate goal of SpaceX is to get humans to Mars. And so the ultimate goal would be to use all of these Starship practice missions here, learning how to get to orbit, learning how to land or how to go around the moon, land on the moon, and then hopefully getting people safely to Mars someday. Their practice for that ultimate goal of getting humans to Mars. So I hope you enjoyed this live stream. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them either in the chat or in the comments. I see, somebody's raising their hand. Now, last week's YouTube YouTube actually cut me off at 30 minutes. I don't know why. I don't know if that was like an accident or if it really does have a 30-minute cutoff, but please ask your question and I'm happy to answer it. So just type it in the chat. I did want to answer a question by Brendan Curry. It's a really fun here. He just asked me what sci-fi novel is crying out to be made into a TV series or movie. And I just finished Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir with my neighborhood book club. I know I'm late to the game here. I thought it was fantastic. I loved it. Really fun movie. I really liked the Mars, the Matt Damon, but I think Project Hail Mary could really be a really good movie. Did you have a question? Can you type it really fast? Okay. So Psychonaut421 says, I was just raising my hand. Oh, you'd like to take a tourist trip to the moon. Okay, you don't have a question. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So you and me both. You and me are both are going to go take a tourist trip to the moon. I really do appreciate you all tuning in for this live stream. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments afterwards or send them to me via social media or through email. And if you do want to get these in your inbox on Monday mornings, feel free to subscribe to the Astrolytical newsletter on astrolytical.com/subscribe or on the Substack. Thank you so much.